But getting back to what we were originally doing, let's go back to, we'll stick with plastic for now. We're going to go to plastic, shiny, and we'll start with red. So we'll grab that and we'll just throw that right on the Ryzen. And for the environment here, we'll stick with that apartment. And let's hold down control and just rotate this around. Hold down control and left mouse click, I should say. And as we rotate this around, you're going to see it's updating that lighting environment on our object. So if you're looking for a nice reflection or a good look, just kind of balance that out and then go over here to environment, turn back on color, and then dial in how you want that to look. You can also over crank the brightness on your HDRI image, so you can just crank that up if you wanted to light more. Or if you have lights in your scene, you can dial that down and balance it out that way. And by lights in my scene, all I mean is if you were to go to say, I mean, you can do this in ZBrush as well. If you're in ZBrush and you just make a poly plane and you import it, you'll have a plane available to you that you can move around by right-clicking going to move. You can also go in here into Pro and go to Edit, Add Geometry, and we can just add, we don't want to add a ground plane, but we'll just add a plane here. So now we've had this plane, its move's already chosen for us, so we can go ahead and just move this around. We can rotate it around here. And we can go ahead and scale it up because scale is checked on now. So we've checked that on. So now we have a plane back here. We'll go ahead and check the checkbox here. Let's go back to our materials, and again we'll go back to the lighting, area light. We'll just drag an area light on here, double click it, and again we'll change that to watts. So now we have a plane in here that is lighting our object. So if we go back here to environment and change this brightness down to 0, you're going to see our environment's no longer lighting our object, just this polyplane is. So if you want to, you can right click this part and you can move, let's see, I think we can move model. There we go. We can kind of rotate this around here. So now you can light this with actual geometry. Check OK. So we can double click this, go to the settings here, you can crank up the wattage, make it a little bit brighter. You can also go in here to advanced and you can say if you want to apply it to the front or the back. If you don't apply it to the front, it looks like this is a reverse, so it actually the front's over here. So we're just applying this to the back of our geometry, which is fine because that's where we want the light to come from. You can also tell it to only be either visible to camera so we can see the light, or if you don't want it to be visible to camera but you still want it to light your object, go ahead and turn that off, and now you can go ahead and light your object and still have it not be visible. It's visible in reflections right now. If you don't want that, you can also turn off visible in reflections, and now it's lighting the object but it's not being reflected, which in this case, because it's a shiny object, I kind of like it better being visible in reflections. One thing I mentioned earlier when we were going through the menus up here is this environment occlusion ground shadow. So if we go over here, you're going to see under environment ground, you're going to see we have ground shadows turned on. If you turn those off, now it's just floating. Now we have ground shadows on. If you turn on occlusion ground shadows, that'll give you an occlusion map underneath these letters and kind of settle them into your scene a little bit more. You can also turn on ground reflections. So now your ground is being reflective here. And the intensity of your ground shadows you can change over here just by making this more or less black. If you want a little bit more control over your ground, I'm going to go up here to Edit, Add Geometry, Add a Ground Plane. That's going to throw a ground plane in here. And the default properties of the ground plane, if we go over here to the scene, you're going to see we now have a new ground plane. If you double click that ground plane, it's going to go to the ground plane material, and you're going to see this material is a ground material. How that reacts in your scene is kind of as a shadow catcher. It also inherits the background color. So if we go back here to environment and change this color from like a gray to a red, the ground plane is going to inherit that red property here, but you can still go through and change the ground properties itself. So what you can do is you can change this specular, say, from black to white. So it'll give us a very reflective specular. And it's also very shiny, so you're going to see it's very reflective, but it doesn't have any diffuse material to itself because it's inheriting the diffuse material. In fact, if we go to the environment here and change back to the lighting environment, let's go back to our scene here in the ground plane. You're going to say we still have a ground plane, but it's not doing anything other than giving you more ground properties. You're going to see if we go down here, we're getting the reflection of the light plane and also the reflection of this object, which in this case doesn't look very realistic because this is wood, but I think you get the idea. Let's go ahead and do back to our color. And we'll change that back to a dark gray. Let's double click the ground. That's going to go to the ground material here. And I'm going to crank this roughness down to 0 and crank the reflection contrast up. So what that's going to do is allow us to see that reflection even better. So we're almost getting a mirror image if we change that to 1. You see we're getting a very, very reflective image down here. So play with these settings if you want to kind of get the effect that you want. Of course, you can also change this here. So we have the scene that we have the ground plane selected, and we have a ground material. If you want, you can change it from a ground material to something like, since we've been working with our plastics, let's go ahead and keep with that. Let's go ahead and change that to a plastic material. And now we have a plastic ground plane that is in our scene here. So again, we have our invisible light casting this light on our object here. And if we crank up this refractive index, again, we're getting a little bit more of that reflection in there. You can go through here and change your specular. If you do it to a mid-gray or to a black, it's going to get less reflective. It's getting less specular, or you can crank it up to white. And you can change the diffuse here to from a light gray to a white to a gray, all the way down to a black. And again, if you go over here to the environment, we've got the light rendering our object, or lighting our object. If we change that brightness back, now we can start dialing in more of that environment here. And again, if you want to completely get rid of that plane that we have out here, just go to your scene and just turn this eyeball off. So you can turn on the eyeball off for that plane, which is our lighting plane. That'll turn the light off for it. And now again, our object is being completely lit by our environment here. So if we double click this now, we can change this back to a ground plane material. That'll inherit our background color and give us the effect that we want. If we don't want it so crisp down here, we can change the roughness of that as well. So you can kind of fuzz that out a little bit. And now we're getting reflections, but they're not quite so crisp. Actually, speaking of reflective grounds, we can go ahead and talk about this real quick. I'm going to go down here to liquids, and you're going to see we have liquid water, we have coffee, Chardonnay, beer, and you can also download more from the cloud library. If you do this liquid water ripples, if we drag this onto our ground plane here, and we double click this, you're going to see we now have a liquid applied to our ground plane, and it's water ripples. So if you go over here to the textures tab, you're going to see you have a bump height and a scale. I'm going to crank this bump height up quite a bit, and the scale is set at 0.2. Looks like 0.5 isn't quite enough, so I'm going to just select this text here, hit 5, and then enter, and we're going to scale this up to 5. So now we can have kind of a rippling water beneath that, and you're going to see it's rippling water that's also reflecting into our image here. And this is all real-time ray tracing all the way, going through here and causing these ripples to be reflected in our image, and also reflecting the Threadripper logo in the water itself. But let's go ahead and undo back. Let's go and Control Z once, twice. There we go. So we're back kind of where we started. And in fact, you know what? We don't even really need that ground plane. So I'm going to take this. You can either turn off the eyeball to not see the ground plane, or you can just right-click the ground plane and delete it. Now we still have some reflections in here. If you don't want that, you can go back to Environment here, and you can turn off Ground Reflections. And now we're just back to kind of where we started.